The distant sound of thunder rolled across the valley as Catherine McBride stood by the river's edge, her tears falling silently into the rushing waters below. The year was 1878, and in just 3 short months, she had lost everything: her husband, her baby son, and now the ranch they had worked so hard to build. The bank foreclosure notice had arrived that morning, the final blow to a heart already shattered beyond repair. She hadn't heard the approaching hoofbeats over the sound of her own grief, but she felt the presence behind her, someone watching, waiting. Catherine didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see what sorrow looked like when it consumed a person whole. "Madam." The voice was deep, gentle despite its natural roughness. "You shouldn't be out here alone. Storm's coming." Catherine didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the stranger. "Let it come," she whispered, her words carried away by the wind. Heavy boots crunched on the rocky riverbank as the man moved closer. "I don't mean to intrude, but you look like you could use some help." "No one can help me now," Catherine replied, her voice hollow, "unless you can bring back the dead or save a ranch with no money." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rushing river and distant rumble of thunder. Then, unexpectedly, a strong hand rested on her shoulder. Catherine flinched but didn't pull away. "My name is Daniel Blackwood," he said. "And I won't pretend I can fix what's broken in your life, madam, but I can offer you shelter from this storm and maybe a meal if you're hungry." Finally, Catherine turned to face him. Daniel Blackwood stood tall, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, they were kind, the sort of eyes that had seen suffering and understood it. "Catherine McBride," she replied, her voice barely audible, "and I don't think I'll ever be hungry again." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the dusty earth and sending tiny ripples across the river's surface. Daniel Blackwood stepped closer, removing his duster and holding it over her head. "Mrs. McBride," he said firmly, "I don't know what's happened to you, but I do know this: standing by a river in a thunderstorm won't solve anything." A flash of irritation cut through Catherine's grief. "And what would you know about it, Mr. Blackwood? What would you know about losing everything you ever loved?" His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those dark eyes. "More than you might think." He gestured toward the horizon. "My camp is just over that ridge. It's not much, but it's dry." Catherine looked down at the river once more. For a moment, she had considered letting the waters take her, joining her husband and son in whatever lay beyond. But something in Daniel Blackwood's steady gaze anchored her to the earth. The rain began to fall harder and Daniel moved closer, his arm almost around her shoulders as he held the coat above her head. "Please, Mrs. McBride." "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You don't know me." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "Because there was a time when no one cared about me, and I swore I'd never be that person." A sob escaped Catherine's throat, and suddenly, Daniel's strong arms were around her, holding her steady as grief overwhelmed her once more. She wept against his chest, her tears mingling with the rain that now poured around them. When she had no more tears left, Catherine felt herself being gently guided away from the riverbank. Daniel kept his arm around her shoulders, supporting her as they walked toward his camp. "This river," he said softly as they climbed the ridge, "one day we'll fill it with laughter again." Catherine didn't believe him. She couldn't imagine laughing ever again, but she let him lead her away from the water's edge, away from the temptation of endless sleep beneath its surface. Daniel's camp was simple but orderly. A small tent was pitched beneath a cluster of pine trees, and a covered wagon stood nearby. A fire pit had been dug and lined with stones, though no fire burned in the increasing rain. "Get inside the tent," Daniel instructed, guiding her toward it. I'll see to my horse and be right with you." Too exhausted to argue, Catherine ducked into the tent. It was sparse but clean, with bedrolls laid out on one side and supplies neatly stacked on the other. She sank down onto a bedroll, her sodden skirts pooling around her. Minutes later, Daniel entered, carrying a small wooden box. "Got some dry clothes here," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "They belonged to my sister. She was about your size." "Was?" Catherine asked, noticing the past tense. Daniel nodded once. "She passed 3 years ago, cholera." "I'm sorry," Catherine whispered. "So am I." He handed her the box. "I'll wait outside while you change, then we should talk about what happens next." Before Catherine could protest that there was no next for her, Daniel had slipped out of the tent, leaving her alone with the box and her thoughts. The clothes were simple but well made: a plain blue dress, undergarments, and a warm shawl. As Catherine changed out of her wet clothes, she wondered about Daniel Blackwood's sister and what kind of woman she had been. When she emerged from the tent, she found Daniel had somehow managed to start a small fire beneath the shelter of the wagon's canvas extension. He sat beside it, brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. "Feel better?" he asked without looking up. "Drier," Catherine replied, which was the most honest answer she could give. Daniel nodded and poured coffee into 2 tin cups. He handed one to Catherine and gestured for her to sit on a fallen log he'd positioned near the fire. "Now," he said after she'd taken a few sips of the strong, bitter coffee, "tell me what happened." And somehow, sitting in the rain with this stranger, Catherine found herself telling the story she'd told no one else. She told him about meeting Thomas McBride when she was just 18, falling in love with the ambitious young rancher with dreams bigger than the Montana sky. She told him about their wedding day and the small ranch they'd purchased with every penny they had. She told him about the birth of their son, William, and the joy that had filled their lives for 6 short months. Then, her voice growing quieter, she told him about the fever that had taken William in just 3 days, and how, in his grief and determination to provide for Catherine, Thomas had taken risks with the ranch, buying cattle they couldn't afford, taking loans they couldn't repay. 2 months ago, she said, staring into the fire, Thomas was driving cattle to market. There was a stampede. They found his body 2 days later. Daniel sat silently, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "The bank gave me until the end of the month," Catherine continued. "But there's no money, there's nothing left." "And your family?" Daniel asked gently. Catherine shook her head. "My parents died years ago. I have a sister in Boston, but we haven't spoken in years. She didn't approve of Thomas. So you were at the river." "Wondering if it wouldn't be easier to join them," Catherine admitted, the words sounding hollow now that she'd spoken them aloud. Daniel's hand moved suddenly, covering hers where it rested on the log between them. His skin was rough, calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "I won't tell you it gets easier," he said. "It doesn't, but you learn to carry it differently." Catherine looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Daniel Blackwood was not a young man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with streaks of gray at his temples. His face bore the marks of a life lived outdoors, lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. But those eyes, they held something that spoke to Catherine's broken heart. They held understanding. "Who did you lose?" she asked. Daniel took a long drink of his coffee before answering. "My wife, Sarah, my daughter, Emily, and my sister, Abigail. All I have left of any of them are memories and Abigail's clothes in that box." "I'm sorry," Catherine whispered. "So am I," Daniel replied. "But I'm still here, and so are you." They sat in silence as the rain continued to fall around them, the fire hissing occasionally when stray drops found their way through the canvas shelter. "What happens tomorrow?" Catherine finally asked. "Tomorrow," Daniel said. "We go to your ranch. We gather whatever you want to keep. And then we decide what comes next." "We?" The word hung between them, a question and a lifeline all at once. Daniel looked at her steadily. "I've been drifting since I lost my family. Working ranch to ranch, taking whatever jobs come my way. I was heading to Billings when I saw you by the river." He paused. "Maybe we were meant to find each other, Mrs. McBride." "Catherine," she corrected softly. "If we're going to be traveling together, you should call me Catherine." A small smile touched Daniel's lips, the first she'd seen. "Catherine," he agreed. That night, Catherine slept in the tent while Daniel made his bed beneath the wagon. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of Thomas and William and the rushing river. But each time she woke, the steady sound of Daniel's breathing nearby reminded her that she was not alone. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. Catherine emerged from the tent to find Daniel already awake, cooking something over a fresh fire. "Hope you like flapjacks," he said by way of greeting. "It's about all I can manage that's fit to eat." "It smells wonderful," Catherine replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt hungry. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the occasional snort from Daniel's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck. "My ranch isn't far," Catherine said as they cleaned up after breakfast. "About 5 miles west of here." Daniel nodded. "We'll head there after we break camp. Is there anything specific you want to bring with you?" Catherine thought about the small homestead she and Thomas had built with such hope. "Just some personal items, photographs, Thomas's pocket watch, William's blanket." "We'll get them all," Daniel promised. Within the hour they had packed up camp and were on their way. Daniel insisted Catherine ride Buck while he walked alongside, leading the horse by the reins. "I've been sitting in a saddle for weeks," he said when she protested. "My legs could use the stretch." The journey to the McBride ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Catherine directed Daniel with occasional words, but otherwise they traveled in silence. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Catherine felt her heart constrict. It wasn't much a small cabin, a barn, corral, and about 40 acres of grazing land, but it had been theirs. Now the cabin looked forlorn, with no smoke rising from the chimney and no life visible around it. "It's not much," Catherine said softly. "It's more than many have," Daniel replied, no judgment in his voice. They approached slowly, and Catherine felt tears threaten again as they entered the yard. Everything was exactly as she had left it the day before, right down to the empty rocking chair on the porch where she used to sit with William. Daniel helped her down from Buck and tied the horse to the hitching post. "Take your time," he said. "I'll wait out here unless you need me." Catherine nodded gratefully and made her way to the cabin door. Inside, the familiar smell of home washed over her wood smoke, linseed oil from Thomas's saddle, the faint scent of the lavender she used to hang from the rafters. For a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, memories overwhelming her. Then, methodically, she began to gather the things she couldn't bear to leave behind. The photograph of her wedding day, carefully removed from its frame to save space. Thomas's pocket watch, still sitting on the mantel where he'd left it before his final cattle drive. The small wooden box that held a lock of William's hair, and the tiny shoes he'd never grown big enough to wear. From the bedroom, she took only a few items of clothing and her mother's silver hairbrush. The rest could be sold or given away. They weren't important anymore. When she had filled a small valise with her treasures, Catherine took one last look around the cabin. In the corner stood William's cradle, lovingly crafted by Thomas from pine wood cut from their own land. Catherine walked to it slowly and ran her hand along the smooth edge. This, too, she would have to leave behind. There was no room for it on their journey, and what use would she have for a cradle now? A soft knock at the door startled her. Daniel stood in the doorway, hat in hand, a respectful expression on his face. "I thought I should check on you," he said. "You've been in here a while." Catherine nodded, her hand still resting on the cradle. "I was just saying goodbye." Daniel's eyes followed her gaze, understanding dawning in his expression. "How old was he?" he asked gently. "6 months," Catherine replied, "just old enough to laugh." Daniel stepped into the cabin, moving to stand beside her. "My Emily was 4 when the fever took her," he said softly, "old enough to have opinions about everything." A small, sad smile touched Catherine's lips. William was just starting to discover his voice. He would babble for hours, having entire conversations with himself. "The house feels empty without them, doesn't it?" Daniel asked. "All the spaces they should fill." Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Daniel reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he seemed to think better of it and let it fall. "We should go," he said. "It's a long ride to Billings." "Billings?" Catherine asked, confused. "Unless you have somewhere else in mind," Daniel replied. "Billings is growing fast. Plenty of work to be found there for both of us." Catherine looked at him sharply. "Both of us?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "I won't leave you on your own, Catherine, not until I know you're settled somewhere safe." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving around the small cabin as if searching for the right words. "Because when I lost Sarah and Emily, I wished someone had been there for me. Someone who understood. I had Abigail then, but after she died too." He shook his head. "No one should face that kind of loss alone." Catherine felt something shift inside her, a tiny crack in the wall of grief she'd built around herself. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel nodded once, then gestured to her valise. "Is that everything you want to take?" "Yes," Catherine said, then hesitated. "Except there's a small garden out back. Thomas planted sunflowers for me. I'd like to take some seeds." "Of course," Daniel agreed. "I'll help you gather them." Together they walked out to the small garden behind the cabin. The sunflowers stood tall, their bright faces turned toward the morning sun. Catherine carefully harvested seeds from several of the largest blooms, wrapping them in a handkerchief before placing them in her valise. "Ready?" Daniel asked when she had finished. Catherine took one last look at the ranch that had been her home, her dream, her heartbreak. "Yes," she said finally. "I'm ready." They left the McBride ranch just as the sun reached its zenith. Daniel insisted on taking a different route than the one that would lead them past the river, and Catherine was silently grateful. They traveled steadily through the afternoon, stopping only once to rest Buck and share the simple lunch of jerky and hardtack that Daniel had packed. As they ate, Daniel outlined his plan. "Billings is about 3 days' ride from here," he explained. "I know a man there, Joseph Miller, who owns a general store. He's been looking for help, and he has rooms to let above the store. I thought you might find work there while you decide what you want to do next." Catherine considered his words carefully. "I have some experience with bookkeeping," she said. "My father was a merchant in Helena before he died. He taught me." Daniel looked pleased. "That's even better. Joe's a good man, but numbers aren't his strong suit." "And what about you?" Catherine asked. "What will you do in Billings?" A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "I've been offered work with a cattle outfit, trail boss for drives up to Montana Territory from Texas." "That sounds dangerous," Catherine observed. Daniel shrugged. "It's what I know. I was a rancher before I lost everything." Catherine wanted to ask more about his past, about the wife and daughter he'd mentioned, but something in his expression warned her not to pry. Instead, she asked, "When would you leave?" "Not until I know you're settled," Daniel said firmly. "I gave you my word." They continued their journey as the afternoon waned, making camp as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains. This time, Daniel set up his tent for Catherine and prepared to sleep under the stars himself. "The rain has passed," he said when she protested, "and the night is warm enough." As darkness fell, they sat beside the campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Catherine found herself studying Daniel when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the careful way he tended the fire, the gentleness with which he treated Buck. "How long have you been alone?" she asked suddenly. Daniel looked up, surprised by the question. "5 years since Sarah and Emily, 3 since Abigail. And you've been drifting all that time," he nodded slowly. "At first I couldn't bear to stay in our home, too many memories, so I sold everything and just started riding, took whatever work came my way. Doesn't it get lonely?" Catherine asked softly. Daniel poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying upward into the night sky. "Loneliness is better than remembering," he said finally, "or at least that's what I told myself. And now," his eyes met hers across the flames, "now I'm not so sure." Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared pain that needed no words. Catherine looked away first, her gaze lifting to the stars that dotted the vast Montana sky. "My mother used to say that the stars are windows," she said. "Windows through which our loved ones watch over us." Daniel followed her gaze upward. "My Sarah believed they were campfires, fires lit by those who have gone ahead to light our way when it's our time to follow." "I like that," Catherine said softly. "The idea that they're waiting for us." "But not too soon," Daniel added, his voice firm. "They would want us to live first." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes. "It's hard to live when they can't." "I know," Daniel replied. "Believe me, I know." They fell silent, each lost in their own memories, until Daniel stood and stretched. "We should get some rest." Morning comes early on the trail. Catherine nodded and rose, gathering her shawl around her shoulders against the cooling night air. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Catherine," he replied, his voice gentle in the darkness. Catherine retreated to the tent, but sleep eluded her for hours. Her mind kept returning to the man sleeping beneath the stars, a man who had known grief as deep as her own, yet somehow found the strength to continue. She wondered if she could find that same strength within herself. The next 2 days passed in a similar fashion. They rode through countryside that gradually changed from open rangeland to more populated areas as they approached Billings. Daniel proved to be a quiet but thoughtful companion, attentive to Catherine's comfort without being overbearing. They talked little during the day, but their evening conversations by the campfire grew longer. Catherine learned that Daniel had been raised on a ranch in Colorado, the son of a cattle rancher and a schoolteacher. He had met his wife, Sarah, when she came to teach at the local school, and they had married when he was 22, and she was 19. Emily came along a year later, he told Catherine on their final night before reaching Billings. She was the spitting image of her mother, same blue eyes, same stubborn chin. "What happened to them?" Catherine asked gently, sensing he needed to speak of them. Daniel stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Scarlet fever swept through our town. Sarah insisted on helping nurse the sick. She caught it first, then Emily." His voice grew rough. "I buried them on the same day." Catherine reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Daniel." He covered her hand with his own, a brief touch that sent warmth spreading through her. "It was a long time ago." "Not so long," Catherine said softly. "Not when you measure time in heartbeats instead of years." Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You understand," he said, wonder in his voice. "Yes," Catherine replied simply. "I do." That night, after Catherine had retired to the tent, she lay awake thinking about Daniel Blackwood. In just 3 days, he had become important to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Not as a replacement for Thomas, no one could ever replace him, but as something new and unexpected. A connection formed in grief, but offering something more. The thought frightened her. She had lost so much already. She wasn't sure she could risk her heart again. And yet, there was something about Daniel that made her want to try. They reached Billings the following afternoon. The town was larger than Catherine had expected, with wide streets lined with businesses and homes in various stages of construction. "Billings is only a few years old," Daniel explained as they rode down the main street. "But it's growing fast because of the railroad." He guided them to a large general store on the corner of a busy intersection. The sign above the door read Miller's General Merchandise, and the windows displayed everything from farm tools to ladies' hats. "This is it," Daniel said, helping Catherine down from Buck. "Joe Miller's place." Catherine smoothed her wrinkled dress and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly conscious of her appearance after days on the trail. "You look fine," Daniel assured her, as if reading her thoughts. "Joe's not one to stand on ceremony." They entered the store to find it bustling with customers. A tall, portly man with a magnificent mustache was behind the counter, wrapping parcels and making change with practiced efficiency. "Joe," Daniel called, raising a hand in greeting. Joseph Miller looked up, and his face broke into a wide smile. "Daniel Blackwood, as I live and breathe. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind about coming to Billings." He came around the counter, wiping his hands on his apron before extending one to Daniel. The men shook hands warmly. "Got delayed," Daniel explained. "Had some matters to attend to." He turned to Catherine. "Joe, this is Mrs. Catherine McBride. Catherine, this is Joseph Miller, the finest merchant in Montana Territory." Joseph Miller's eyes widened slightly at the introduction, but he recovered quickly and gave Catherine a respectful nod. "Mrs. McBride, it's a pleasure to meet you." "Likewise, Mr. Miller," Catherine replied, attempting a smile that felt foreign on her face. "Catherine is looking for work," Daniel continued. "She has experience with bookkeeping and mercantile business." Joseph's expression brightened considerably. "Is that so? Well now, that is interesting. As it happens, I'm in dire need of someone with a head for numbers. My ledgers are in a state that would make an accountant weep." "I'd be happy to take a look," Catherine offered. "Wonderful," Joseph exclaimed. "And as for lodging, I have 2 rooms available above the store. They're simple but clean." "2 rooms would be perfect," Daniel said, glancing at Catherine. "If that's agreeable to you," Catherine nodded, relief washing over her. Despite the growing connection between them, she wasn't ready for anything more intimate than friendship with Daniel Blackwood. "Excellent." Joseph clapped his hands together. "Let me just finish with these customers and then I'll show you upstairs." As Joseph returned to the counter, Daniel leaned closer to Catherine. "Will this be all right?" he asked quietly. "I know it's not what you're used to." Catherine looked around the busy store, taking in the variety of goods, the steady stream of customers, the sense of purpose that filled the space. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "Thank you, Daniel." The rooms above Miller's store were indeed simple but clean, just as Joseph had promised. Each contained a narrow bed, a small dresser, a washstand, and a chair. A single window in each room looked out over the main street of Billings. "The washroom is at the end of the hall," Joseph explained as he showed them around. "You'll have to share it with my nephew, Timothy, who helps in the store, but he's a tidy young man." "It's more than adequate," Catherine assured him. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Miller. Please call me Joe," he insisted. "Everyone does." After Joseph had returned to the store, Daniel helped Catherine bring her valise up to her room. He stood awkwardly in the doorway as she set it on the bed. "Will you be comfortable here?" he asked. "Yes," Catherine said. "It's a fresh start. That's what I need right now." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "I should see to Buck," he said. "Get him stabled and fed." "Of course," Catherine replied. "Will I see you for dinner?" A smile touched Daniel's lips. "I wouldn't miss it. Joe's wife, Martha, is the best cook in 3 territories." After Daniel left, Catherine unpacked her meager belongings, arranging them carefully in the dresser drawers. The photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day she placed on top of the dresser, along with William's tiny shoes. She ran her fingers over the soft leather of the shoes, remembering the small feet that had once filled them. For the first time since their deaths, the memory brought a bittersweet smile to her lips instead of only pain. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty room. "I'll always miss you. But I think I need to try to live again." That evening, Catherine met Daniel and the Millers for dinner in the small dining room behind the store. Martha Miller proved to be as warm and welcoming as her husband, immediately taking Catherine under her wing. "You poor dear," she said when Joseph explained Catherine's situation in vague terms. "You must be exhausted after your journey, and so thin. We'll have to fatten you up a bit." True to Daniel's word, Martha was an excellent cook. The table groaned under the weight of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, fresh bread, and vegetables from Martha's garden. As they ate, Joseph outlined the work he hoped Catherine would do in the store. "I need someone to manage the books, keep track of inventory, and help with ordering," he explained. "The store has grown faster than I can handle on my own, especially with the railroad bringing in new settlers every week." "I'd be happy to help," Catherine said. "When would you like me to start?" "How about tomorrow?" Joseph suggested. "No time like the present," Catherine agreed, grateful for the chance to busy her mind with work. The conversation turned to other matters: the growth of Billings, the coming railroad spur, the cattle business that had brought Daniel to town. "Reynolds Cattle Company is one of the biggest outfits in the territory now," Joseph told them. "They're lucky to have snagged you as trail boss, Daniel." Daniel shrugged modestly. "I'm just glad for the work." "When do you leave?" Martha asked, passing a plate of pie around the table. "End of the week," Daniel replied, his eyes briefly meeting Catherine's across the table. "Need to head down to Texas to gather the herd." Catherine felt a pang at the thought of Daniel leaving so soon. In just a few days, he had become her anchor in a world that had been spinning out of control since Thomas's death. After dinner, Daniel walked Catherine up the outside stairs that led to the rooms above the store. The night was clear, with a crescent moon hanging low in the western sky. "Joe and Martha are good people," Daniel said as they reached the landing. "You'll be safe here." "Thanks to you," Catherine replied. "I don't know how to repay you for your kindness." Daniel shook his head. "There's nothing to repay. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Catherine said firmly. "Not anyone. Most would have passed by a weeping woman at the river and thought it none of their business." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his face shadowed in the moonlight. "I couldn't pass by," he said finally. "Not when I recognized the look in your eyes." "What look?" Catherine asked softly. "The look of someone considering joining their loved ones too soon," Daniel replied, his voice equally soft. "I wore that same look for a long time after Sarah and Emily died." Catherine felt tears well up in her eyes. "Does it ever go away? The pain?" Daniel reached out slowly, his hand cupping her cheek. His touch was gentle, tentative, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, his thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped. "No," he said honestly. But it changes, becomes something you can carry without being crushed beneath it. Catherine leaned into his touch, finding comfort in the warmth of his hand against her skin. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of forgetting them, afraid of remembering, afraid of being alone." "I understand," Daniel whispered. "More than you know." For a moment they stood there in the moonlight, connected by touch and shared grief. Then, slowly, Daniel withdrew his hand and took a step back. "You should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a busy day for you." Catherine nodded, suddenly aware of how inappropriate their closeness might appear to others. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Catherine," he replied, his voice warm in the darkness. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Catherine threw herself into the work at Miller's store, grateful for the distraction it provided. Joseph's books were indeed in disarray, and she spent hours sorting through ledgers, invoices, and inventory lists. By the end of her third day, she had organized the financial records and created a new system for tracking inventory that Joseph declared nothing short of miraculous. "You're a godsend, Mrs. McBride," he told her as they closed the store that evening. "I don't know how I managed before you came." "Poorly from the looks of your ledgers," Catherine replied with a small smile. Joseph laughed heartily. Truer words were never spoken. Daniel, meanwhile, spent his days preparing for the cattle drive. He would stop by the store each evening to walk Catherine to dinner at the Millers, but their time together was limited. On the night before his departure, they sat on the landing outside Catherine's room after dinner, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "I'll be gone 3 months, maybe 4, Daniel said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The drive takes us south to Texas, then back with the herd to the railhead at Cheyenne." Catherine nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest at the thought of his absence. "It sounds like difficult work." "It is," Daniel agreed. "Long days, short nights, and plenty of things that can go wrong in between." "Will you be careful?" The question slipped out before Catherine could stop it. Daniel looked at her, surprise and something else, something warmer in his eyes. "I will," he promised. "I have a reason to come back now." Catherine felt her cheeks warm and she looked away, back up at the stars. "Joe and Martha have been very kind," she said, deliberately misunderstanding him. "I can see why you'd want to return to such good friends." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "It's not just Joe and Martha I'll be coming back to, Catherine." She turned to find him watching her, his expression serious. "Daniel," she began, uncertainty in her voice. "I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "For both of us. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I just—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I just want you to know that meeting you has changed something for me, made me realize I've been existing, not living, these past years." Catherine felt tears well up in her eyes. "I feel the same," she whispered, "and it frightens me." "Why?" Daniel asked gently. "Because I lost everything once," Catherine replied, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I could survive losing everything again." Daniel reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "We can't know what the future holds," he said. "But I do know this: sometimes the heart is brave enough to love again, even when the mind is still afraid." Catherine looked down at their joined hands, at the way his larger one enveloped hers so completely. "Will you write to me?" she asked. "While you're gone?" "Every chance I get," Daniel promised. "And I'll be thinking of you every day." They sat in silence for a while longer, hands still linked, until the chill of the night air drove them inside. At Catherine's door, Daniel hesitated, then leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Catherine," he said softly. "Sleep well." "Good night, Daniel," she replied, her skin tingling where his lips had touched. "Be safe tomorrow." Daniel left early the next morning before the store opened. Catherine watched from her window as he rode away, his broad shoulders straight, his hat pulled low against the morning sun. Only when he had disappeared from view did she allow herself to acknowledge the ache in her heart. Life in Billings fell into a routine for Catherine. She worked in the store 6 days a week, keeping the books and helping customers when needed. On Sundays, she attended church with the Millers and then spent the afternoon either reading or walking around the growing town. True to his word, Daniel wrote whenever he could. His letters arrived irregularly, often several at once after weeks of silence, carried by whoever was traveling north from the cattle drives. Catherine treasured each one, reading them multiple times until she knew the words by heart. He wrote of the cattle drive, the long days in the saddle, the challenges of river crossings, the camaraderie around the campfire at night. He described the vast Texas landscape and the characters he met along the trail. And always, at the end of each letter, he would write about his return. "I find myself counting the days," one letter read, "not to the end of the drive, but to the moment I see you again. The thought of your smile is what keeps me going on the hardest days." Catherine replied to each letter, sending her responses to posts along the cattle trail in hopes they would reach him. She told him about her life in Billings, about the friends she was making, about the small garden she had started behind the store with Martha's help. "Your sunflower seeds have taken root," she wrote in one letter. "They reach for the sun each morning, just as I find myself reaching for memories of our conversations to brighten my day." As the weeks passed, Catherine noticed a change in herself. The crushing weight of grief began to lift, not disappearing entirely but shifting, becoming something she could carry without being bent double beneath it. She found herself laughing at Joseph's jokes, enjoying Martha's company, taking pleasure in small things like the scent of fresh bread or the sound of rain on the roof. And always, there was the anticipation of Daniel's return, a bright spot on the horizon that grew closer with each passing day. Then, 2 months after Daniel's departure, disaster struck. A fire broke out in a livery stable 2 buildings down from Miller's store. Despite the best efforts of the townspeople, the flames spread quickly, engulfing several businesses before it was brought under control. Miller's store was damaged but not destroyed. The main floor suffered smoke and water damage, but the structure remained sound. The rooms above, including Catherine's, were largely untouched in the aftermath. As they surveyed the damage, Joseph's normally cheerful face was drawn with worry. "Insurance will cover some of it," he told Catherine as they stood amid the soggy remains of his merchandise. "But not nearly enough." "We'll rebuild," Catherine said firmly. "The books are safe, the building is sound, and you have the goodwill of everyone in town." "It's not that simple," Joseph sighed. "I was already stretched thin with the new inventory I ordered for fall without that stock to sell." Catherine thought quickly. "What about a loan? The bank in Helena might—" Joseph shook his head. "Already tried. They won't lend to businesses affected by the fire until the cause is determined." Catherine fell silent, her mind racing. Then slowly an idea began to form. "What if," she said carefully, "I were to invest in the business?" Joseph looked at her in surprise. "Invest?" "But I thought—" "I sold my husband's ranch," Catherine explained. "The money has been sitting in the bank in Helena. I was saving it, though I didn't know what for." She took a deep breath. "I'd like to become your partner, Joe, if you'll have me." Joseph stared at her for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Mrs. McBride, Catherine, are you sure about this?" "Completely," Catherine replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt certain about something. "This store, this town, you and Martha, you've given me a second chance at life. Let me help give the store a second chance too. And so, while Daniel was still on the cattle drive, Catherine McBride became a partner in what was now called Miller and McBride General Merchandise. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity as they cleaned, repaired, and restocked the store. Catherine wrote to Daniel about the fire and her decision to invest in the business. "I hope you'll approve," she wrote. "It feels right, like something Thomas would have wanted for me to build something new from the ashes of what was lost." His reply came swiftly, carried by a ranch hand heading north. "I couldn't be prouder," he wrote. "You found your strength, Catherine, though I always knew it was there. I'm counting the days until I see the new Miller and McBride establishment and its remarkable co-owner." The store reopened 6 weeks after the fire, just as the first snow dusted the mountains surrounding Billings. The townspeople turned out in force to support the business, and by the end of the first day, Catherine and Joseph were exhausted but elated. "We did it," Joseph said as they counted the day's receipts. "And it's all thanks to you, Catherine." "We did it together," Catherine corrected him. "Partners, remember." That night, as Catherine lay in her bed above the newly reopened store, she found herself thinking of Daniel. According to his last letter, the cattle drive was nearing its end. He would be back in Billings within the month, perhaps in time for Christmas. The thought filled her with both anticipation and anxiety. So much had changed since he left. She had changed. What if he had changed too? What if the connection they had begun to form had been a product of shared grief rather than something more lasting? As December arrived, bringing with it colder temperatures and the festive spirit of the approaching holidays, Catherine found herself watching the road south of town whenever she had a free moment. The store was busier than ever with Christmas shoppers, but Catherine's thoughts were increasingly occupied with Daniel's return. Martha noticed, of course. Nothing escaped her kind but observant eyes. "He'll be here soon," she reassured Catherine one evening as they prepared dinner together. "The drive is probably just taking longer than expected." "I know," Catherine replied, trying to sound unconcerned. "I just hope he's safe." Martha patted her hand sympathetically. "That man has survived worse than a cattle drive, dear, and he has something to come back for now." 2 weeks before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm hit Billings, blanketing the town in white and making travel nearly impossible. Catherine tried not to worry, telling herself that Daniel was experienced enough to seek shelter during such weather, but her concern grew with each passing day. Then, on the morning of December 20th, as Catherine was arranging a display of Christmas candies near the front window of the store, she looked up to see a familiar figure riding slowly down the main street. Daniel sat tall in the saddle despite obvious exhaustion, his coat covered in snow, his beard longer and his face more weathered than when he'd left. But it was him, and Catherine's heart leaped at the sight. Without a word to Joseph, she untied her apron, dropped it on the counter, and hurried out into the snow-covered street. Daniel saw her the moment she stepped outside. He reined Buck to a halt and dismounted slowly, his movements stiff from cold and long days in the saddle. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the middle of the snowy street, neither moving, neither speaking. Then Catherine was running, her skirts gathered in her hands, and Daniel was striding toward her, and they met in a collision of arms and breath and pent-up emotion. Daniel's arms went around her, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of months of longing. Catherine clung to him, breathing in the scent of leather and horses and the cold, clean smell of snow. "You're here," she whispered against his shoulder. "You're really here." "I promised I would come back," Daniel replied, his voice rough with emotion. He set her gently on her feet but didn't release her from his embrace. "Though I didn't plan on bringing half the winter with me." Catherine laughed. tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "I don't care about the snow, I'm just glad you're safe." Daniel's eyes roamed over her face as if memorizing every detail. "You look different," he said softly. Catherine felt a moment of uncertainty. "Different?" A smile warmed Daniel's tired face. "Alive," he said simply. "You look alive." The word resonated within Catherine. Alive. Yes, that was exactly how she felt, as if the frozen parts of her heart had thawed, allowing life to flow through her once more. "Come inside," she said, suddenly aware that they were standing in the middle of the street, creating a spectacle for anyone who cared to look. "You must be freezing and hungry." Daniel allowed her to lead him into the store, where Joseph greeted him with a hearty handshake and many questions about the cattle drive. Martha, summoned from the back room, insisted that Daniel come to dinner that evening after he had rested and cleaned up. "You look like you've been through a war, Daniel Blackwood," she declared, her tone disapproving but her eyes kind. "A hot meal and a warm bed is what you need. And perhaps a bath," Joseph added with a grin, wrinkling his nose. "No offense, my friend, but you smell like you've been living with cattle for months." "Because I have," Daniel replied with a tired laugh. As the Millers fussed over him, Catherine stood back, drinking in the sight of him. He was thinner, more weathered, with new lines etched around his eyes and mouth. But underneath the trailed dust and exhaustion, he was still Daniel, still the man who had found her at her lowest moment and shown her a path forward. That evening, after Daniel had rested, bathed, and changed into clean clothes, he joined the Millers and Catherine for dinner. Martha had outdone herself, preparing a feast to welcome him home. As they ate, Daniel regaled them with tales from the cattle drive, the stampede they'd narrowly averted, the crossing of the Powder River during an early snow, the characters among the cowboys who had become his friends during the long journey. "And the best part," he concluded, "is that Reynolds was so pleased with how we handled the drive that he's offered me a permanent position, not just as trail boss, but as foreman of his ranch here in Montana Territory." "Daniel, that's wonderful," Catherine exclaimed. "Where is the ranch?" "About 20 miles east of Billings," Daniel replied, his eyes on her face. "Close enough to visit town regularly." The implication was clear, and Catherine felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. After dinner, while Joseph and Martha cleared the table, Daniel asked Catherine if she would walk with him. Despite the cold, she agreed, and they bundled up and stepped out into the crisp winter night. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear, stars glittering like diamonds against the black velvet of the night. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air as they walked slowly down the main street. "I want to see the river," Daniel said after they had walked in companionable silence for a while. "Is it far?" "No," Catherine replied. "Just at the edge of town." They made their way through the snow-covered streets until they reached the banks of the Yellowstone River. In the moonlight, it looked different from the river where Daniel had found Catherine months ago, wider, more powerful, yet somehow less threatening. Daniel stood at the riverbank, his hands in his pockets, looking out over the dark water. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day by the river?" he asked without turning. Catherine moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You said one day we would fill it with laughter again." Daniel nodded, his profile strong against the starlit sky. "I meant it, Catherine. Even then, when we were strangers to each other, I meant it." He turned to face her, taking her gloved hands in his. "These past months, your letters have been a lifeline for me. Reading about your life here, the store, the garden, it gave me something to look forward to, something to come back for." Catherine squeezed his hands, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "Your letters meant the same to me," she said softly. They help me believe in tomorrow again. Daniel's eyes were intense in the moonlight. Catherine, I know it's still soon. I know we both carry ghosts with us, but I can't deny what I feel for you. He took a deep breath, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. I love you, Catherine McBride, not in place of Sarah, just as I know you don't love me in place of Thomas, but differently, newly. A love born from shared understanding and second chances. Catherine felt tears well up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, of relief, of joy. I love you too, Daniel, she whispered. I think part of me has since that day by the river when you held me while I wept. Daniel released her hands to cup her face gently between his palms. May I kiss you, Catherine? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Catherine rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them wary of the ghosts that stood witness. But then Daniel's arms went around her, pulling her closer, and Catherine's hands found their way inside his coat, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of new beginnings and promised tomorrows. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said softly. Not right away if you're not ready, but someday. Be my wife, my partner, my second chance. Catherine didn't hesitate. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. They stood there by the river, holding each other as the moon traced its path across the winter sky. And for the first time since she had lost Thomas and William, Catherine felt truly at peace. As they walked back to town, hand in hand, Catherine found herself laughing at something. Daniel said, a full, genuine laugh that bubbled up from a place she had thought long frozen. Daniel stopped, looking at her with wonder. Do you know, he said, that's the first time I've heard you really laugh. Catherine smiled up at him. It feels good, she admitted, like coming home after a long journey. Daniel pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. That's what you are to me, Catherine, home. Spring came early to Montana territory that year. By March, the snow had melted, and the first green shoots were pushing through the soil. Daniel had taken up his position as foreman of the Reynolds Ranch, but rode into Billings at least once a week to see Catherine. Their courtship progressed slowly, both of them mindful of their past losses and the need to build something new with care and patience. They set their wedding date for June, when the wildflowers would carpet the plains, and the days would be long and warm. Catherine continued to work at Miller and McBride, the store thriving under their joint management. She had moved into a small house on the edge of town, which Daniel helped her purchase with some of the money from her ranch sale. It's an investment in our future, he told her when she protested that they could live above the store after they were married. A place where we can build memories that belong just to us. The house was simple but solidly built, with a front porch perfect for watching sunsets and a large yard where Catherine immediately began planting a garden. The first things to go into the ground were the sunflower seeds she had taken from her old ranch, now carefully nurtured through the winter. In late April, Daniel surprised Catherine by arriving in town midweek, which was unusual for him. He found her in the garden behind her house, planting the last of her vegetable seeds. Daniel, she exclaimed, rising from her knees and wiping her hands on her apron. I wasn't expecting you until Saturday. Daniel smiled, but Catherine noticed tension in his expression. Is everything all right? She asked, worry immediately creeping into her voice. Everything's fine, he assured her. But I need to show you something. Can you come with me? Just for the afternoon. Intrigued, Catherine agreed. She quickly changed out of her gardening clothes, and soon they were riding out of town, Daniel on Buck and Catherine on a gentle mare he had brought for her. Where are we going? She asked as they rode east away from Billings. It's a surprise, Daniel replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But I think you'll like it." They rode for about an hour, the landscape opening up around them as they left the town behind. Rolling hills gave way to broader plains, dotted with wildflowers and occasional stands of cottonwood trees. Finally, Daniel reined Buck to a halt beside a small creek. In the distance, Catherine could see a herd of cattle grazing peacefully, and nearby the outline of what appeared to be a small cabin. "What is this place?" she asked as Daniel helped her dismount. "Reynolds Ranch land," Daniel replied. "The far eastern section." He took her hand and led her toward the cabin. "Reynolds gave me this parcel as part of my compensation. 200 acres, the cabin, and grazing rights for my own small herd." Catherine looked at him in surprise. "Your own land, Daniel, that's wonderful." He nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "It needs work," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "The roof leaks and the corral is falling down, but it could be a good place, a place to start over." Understanding dawned on Catherine. "You want us to live here after we're married," she said softly. "Only if you want to," Daniel was quick to add. "I know you have the house in town and your partnership with Joe. I would never ask you to give those up." Catherine walked slowly toward the cabin, taking in the peaceful surroundings. The creek gurgled nearby, its banks lined with willows just beginning to leaf out. Meadowlarks sang in the grass, and in the distance, the mountains rose blue against the horizon. The cabin itself was simple but solid, built of logs with a stone chimney. The door creaked as Catherine pushed it open, revealing a single large room with a small loft above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows let in streams of afternoon sunlight. "It's smaller than your house in town," Daniel said, watching her carefully, "and farther from the store." Catherine turned slowly, taking in the space, not seeing it as it was, but as it could be. She imagined curtains at the windows, a table where they would share meals, a rocking chair by the fire. She imagined children's laughter filling the empty spaces. "It's perfect," she said finally, turning to Daniel with a smile that lit her entire face. "It's absolutely perfect." Relief and joy spread across Daniel's features. "Really? You wouldn't mind living out here?" Catherine shook her head. "I could ride into town for work when needed. And maybe eventually." She hesitated, suddenly shy. "Eventually," Daniel prompted, moving closer to her. Catherine took a deep breath. "Eventually we might need the space for a family." Daniel's eyes widened, then softened with emotion. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her into his arms. "A family," he repeated, his voice thick. "I'd like that very much." Catherine leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "So would I," she whispered, "more than I realized until now." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property. Daniel showed her the small corral where he planned to keep horses, the meadow where he thought they might plant a garden, the stand of cottonwoods that would provide shade in the summer heat. As the sun began to set, they sat by the creek, sharing the lunch Martha had packed for them. The water burbled over stones, creating a soothing melody that complemented the evening birdsong. "I come here sometimes," Daniel admitted, "when I need to think. There's something about this place that feels right, like it was waiting for us." Catherine leaned against his shoulder, watching the water catch the golden light of the setting sun. "It reminds me a little of the river where you found me," she said softly, "but happier somehow." Daniel's arm tightened around her. "No sad memories here," he agreed. "Just the ones we'll make together." As they rode back to Billings in the gathering dusk, Catherine felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The pain of losing Thomas and William would always be with her, a scar on her heart that would never completely fade. But alongside that pain, Something new had grown a love for Daniel that was different but equally powerful, equally real. The weeks leading up to their wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Catherine and Daniel spent every spare moment working on the cabin, making it ready for their life together. Joseph and Martha, along with many of the townspeople who had come to know and respect Catherine, pitched in to help. By early June, the cabin had been transformed. The roof was repaired, the inside walls plastered and whitewashed, new glass installed in the windows. Catherine had sewn curtains and quilts, while Daniel had crafted simple but sturdy furniture. The garden was planted, a mix of vegetables and flowers, with Catherine's sunflowers standing tall along the southern edge. Daniel had rebuilt the corral and constructed a small barn where they could shelter animals during the harsh Montana winters. Their wedding took place on the longest day of the year, June 21, 1879. They chose to hold it on their own land, beside the creek where wildflowers now bloomed in profusion. A simple arch, decorated with ribbons and flowers, marked the spot where they would exchange their vows. Nearly everyone from Billings made the journey to witness the ceremony. Even Sam Reynolds, Daniel's employer, attended with his family. They set up tables beneath the cottonwoods, laden with food prepared by Martha and the other women of the town. Catherine wore a dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Chicago. It was simpler than the elaborate wedding gown she had worn when she married Thomas, but somehow more suited to the woman she had become. Daniel waited for her beneath the arch, dressed in a new suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. When Catherine appeared, walking toward him on Joseph's arm, the look of wonder and love on Daniel's face made her heart swell with joy. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They had written their own vows, words that acknowledged their past losses while embracing their shared future. "Catherine," Daniel said, holding her hands in his as they faced each other beneath the arch, "I come to you with an open heart, scarred but healing. I promise to walk beside you through whatever life brings, to share your joys and sorrows, to build a home filled with love and laughter. You found me when I was lost, though I didn't know it until I found you. I will spend the rest of my days thanking God for leading me to that river on that rainy day." Tears filled Catherine's eyes as she spoke her own vows. "Daniel, you held me when I thought I could not stand, showed me a path when I saw only darkness. I promise to be your partner in all things, to face each day with courage because you are beside me. With you, I have learned that the heart can love again, differently but no less deeply. I promise to fill our home with laughter, our days with purpose, and our lives with love." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Daniel kissed Catherine beneath the arch while their friends and neighbors applauded. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and drink, stories and laughter. As the sun began to set, Daniel took Catherine's hand and led her away from the festivities, down to the creek where they could have a moment alone. "Happy?" he asked, his arms around her waist as they watched the water flow past. "More than I thought possible," Catherine replied, leaning back against his chest. "Are you, completely?" Daniel pressed a kiss to her hair. "Mrs. Blackwood." The name, her new name, sent a shiver of pleasure through Catherine. "It sounds right," she said softly, "like it was always meant to be mine." Daniel turned her in his arms to face him. "Do you remember the promise I made to you that first day by the river?" Catherine nodded. "You said we would fill it with laughter again. Look around us," Daniel said, gesturing to their land, their home, their friends celebrating nearby. "Listen." Catherine did, hearing the sounds of music and laughter, the burble of the creek, the evening songs of birds in the cottonwoods. And her own laughter, joining Daniel's as he lifted her off her feet and spun her in a circle beside the water. "Promise kept," she said when he set her down, her arms still around his neck. "The first of many," Daniel replied, and sealed the words with a kiss. 5 years passed, years filled with hard work, growth, and joy. The Reynolds Ranch prospered under Daniel's management, while Miller and McBride became one of the most successful businesses in Billings. Catherine continued her partnership with Joseph, riding into town twice a week to manage the books and help with major decisions. The cabin by the creek expanded as their family grew. First came a proper bedroom, then a larger kitchen, and finally, a small room with a window that faced the morning sun. In that room, 2 years after their wedding, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, for the wild roses that bloomed along the creek each spring. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, Michael, named for Daniel's father. The children thrived in the open spaces of the ranch, growing strong and healthy under the Montana sky. Rose had Catherine's auburn hair and Daniel's dark eyes, while Michael was his father in miniature, from his broad shoulders to his thoughtful expression. On a warm summer evening in 1884, Catherine sat on the porch of their home, watching Daniel teaching 5-year-old Rose to ride her new pony in the yard. 3-year-old Michael sat on Catherine's lap, his small fingers playing with the locket she wore around her neck, a locket that contained miniature portraits of Thomas and William on one side and a family photograph of the Blackwoods on the other. "Who's that?" Michael asked, pointing to the open locket. "That's your half-brother, William," Catherine explained gently, "and that's his father. They live in heaven now." Michael considered this with the seriousness only a 3-year-old can muster. "Do they miss us?" Catherine kissed the top of his head, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. "I think they're happy that we're happy," she said. "And they watch over us, just like we watch over you." Satisfied with this answer, Michael wiggled off her lap and ran to join his sister and father. Catherine watched as Daniel swung him up to sit in front of Rose on the pony, his strong hands keeping both children secure. The sound of their laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the eternal murmur of the creek. Catherine closed the locket and let it rest against her heart, where it belonged, the past and present together, neither diminishing the other. Daniel looked up and caught her watching them. His smile, still capable of making her heart skip a beat after all these years, spread across his face. He said something to the children, then walked toward the porch while they continued their riding lesson. "What are you thinking about, sitting here all alone?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch step. Catherine leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and horses, and the soap she made herself with lavender from their garden. "I was thinking about promises," she said, "and rivers, and how sometimes the end of one journey is just the beginning of another." Daniel's arm went around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "Any regrets?" he asked, his voice low. Catherine looked out at their home, their land, their children, at the life they had built together from the ashes of their separate griefs. "Not one," she replied truthfully. "Every step, even the painful ones, led me here. Led us here." Daniel pressed a kiss to her temple. "I thank God for that river every day," he said softly, "and for the woman who was brave enough to keep living even when it seemed impossible. And I thank God for the cowboy who stopped to help her," Catherine replied, turning her face up to his for a proper kiss. From the yard came the sound of children's laughter, rising like music into the evening air. Just as Daniel had promised all those years ago by a different river, they had filled this one with laughter again. And sitting there on the porch of the home they had built together, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that they always would.